Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 2. Today we are going to begin our discussion of the Enlightenment. As always, there are some key terms you should be able to recognize by the time this lecture is over, as well as some questions that I'd like you to be able to answer as well. That said, let's get to it. In June of 1776, delegates of the Second Continental Congress were meeting in Philadelphia to decide on a future course of action for their society. Great Britain's 13 colonies in America had been in open rebellion for more than a year, yet no one was sure where that rebellion would lead. Some argued in favor of reconciliation with King George III. Others argued for making an official break with the mother country. Ultimately, the Continental Congress argued for the second of those two options. Yet the representatives of the colonies said that a statement needed to be made to the world, explaining the reasons behind the push for independence. Thomas Jefferson, a young representative from Virginia, was asked to write the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson did so. Here is part of what he wrote. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, if Jefferson had been a student at Clark, he may have been brought up on charges of plagiarism for this paragraph. There is hardly an original idea here. Instead, Jefferson took most of this from other sources, including from this man, John Locke. As we discussed in a previous class, Locke was an English philosopher whose ideas gained great respect during England's Glorious Revolution. Locke argued that the power to govern came not from God, as absolutist monarchs claimed, but from the people. He also discussed the concept that all human beings are born with certain natural rights, or as he put it, the right to life, liberty, and property. But Locke was not the only one speaking and writing about natural rights of human beings. He was one of many thinkers who revolutionized the way we see the world. These thinkers are part of what we today refer to as the Enlightenment. But what was the Enlightenment? Well, there are many definitions of the Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, argued that the Enlightenment was a man's leaving his self-caused immaturity. This is an interesting way of looking at it, as it implies that humanity had been intentionally holding back ideas and progress. In a way, he is correct. The Church had long been hostile to ideas that seemed to contradict Church doctrine. Moreover, feudalism enforced the inequality of human society and prevented the lower classes from advancing. But Kant's definition doesn't really tell us how humanity left behind its immaturity, or what was involved in the process. I looked up the Enlightenment on Merriam-Webster's online dictionary for a few clues, and here is what it says. A movement of the 18th century that stressed the belief that science and logic give people more knowledge and understanding than tradition and religion. What we can learn here is that the Enlightenment occurred in the 1700s, and that it put an emphasis on science and on logic. Now, this is a good place to begin. As Merriam-Webster points out, the Enlightenment owes quite a bit to science. Specifically, it owes a debt to the Scientific Revolution. The Scientific Revolution was a gradual change in the way Western civilization saw and studied the natural world. As one text puts it, the Scientific Revolution was the collapse of the medieval worldview. That worldview was dominated by religion. In short, scientific research had to conform to religious teaching. Anyone who strayed outside that box was in danger of running into the Inquisition. Now, the man typically given credit for launching a new era in scientific inquiry was a Polish mathematician named Nicholas Copernicus, who challenged the very organization of the universe. The traditional view was that the Earth was at the center of the universe. It was a view supported by ancient philosophers and scientists, such as Aristotle and Ptolemy. That's because it seemed to fit with what what they observed around them. The Earth never seems to move, while the planets, the sun, the moon, and the stars do seem to move across the sky. The Church accepted this view as well because it fit certain biblical passages, which also seemed to imply that the Earth was at the center of the universe. Copernicus initially accepted this view as well, but as he tried to use math to predict the movement of the planets, he discovered that his calculations were off. It was only when he moved the sun to the center of the universe that things seemed to fall into place. Copernicus did not celebrate his discovery, however. Instead, knowing that his ideas would be controversial, he held off publishing them until 1543, or just before his death. Copernicus had good reason to worry. Remember Brother Giordano Bruno? He was the Catholic monk who in 1600 was brutally executed by the Inquisition for heresy. One of his supposed heresies was his teaching of Copernicus's model. A short time after Bruno's death, an Italian mathematician by the name of Galileo Galilei was criticized by church officials for teaching, among other things, that Copernicus was right. As one inquisitor put it, quote, that the doctrine that the sun was the center of the world and immovable was false and absurd, formally heretical and contrary to Scripture, whereas the doctrine that the earth was not the center of the world, but moved and has further a daily motion, was philosophically false and absurd, and theologically at least erroneous. Ultimately, Galileo was brought before the Inquisition and forced to declare that he had been wrong in supporting Copernicus. He was convicted anyway and placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. Excuse me. Still, the damage had been done. The more research that was done, the more the ideas of Copernicus and Galileo and other scientists of the day were confirmed. If the Church had been wrong about the organization of the universe, some began to speculate on what else it might have gotten wrong. This bred skepticism and led some to argue that to truly know how the natural world operates, one must rely on reason rather than on faith. Another concept new to this period was the idea of natural law. The idea came from Sir Isaac Newton, who used the scientific method of experimentation and reason. In other words, basing your theories on evidence and conclusions. He used this to work out certain laws about how gravity works and how objects move. He referred to these as, quote, natural laws, end quote, because he argued that these laws applied everywhere in the universe. They were the laws of nature, and they were entirely predictable and knowable. But what does any of this have to do with the Enlightenment? Well, let's just look at Newton for a second. If Newton was correct that the universe is governed by natural law and that these natural laws are knowable and predictable, isn't it possible that all areas of life could be understood in the same way? Many began to think that natural law could be used to understand everything, from government to economics, even to art. John Locke was working at roughly the same time as Newton, and he too picked up on these ideas. In his essay concerning human understanding, which he wrote in 1690, he put forth the idea of the tabula rasa. In other words, every human being was born the same, a blank slate. Quote, let us suppose the mind to be, as we shall say, a white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it? By that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it, with an almost endless variety. Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience, end quote. The implications of Locke's ideas were huge. If experience and environment were what shaped us, rather than heredity and social class, then couldn't society be improved? Couldn't individuals be improved simply by changing their environment and by exposing them to proper influences? Think about it. Could feudalism, could inequality long survive if we agreed that human beings were all equal at birth, and that with education and proper experience, they could progress and improve? Another factor that contributed to the Enlightenment was European exploration and colonization. Beginning with Christopher Columbus in 1492 and continuing throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, Europeans spread across the globe, encountering new cultures and new peoples. One of the key concepts to come out of these explorations is that of the noble savage. The noble savage was a term used to describe the native peoples encountered in America, in Asia, and on the islands of the Pacific. These peoples were often described as living in complete freedom without class or feudal obligations. Nor did they live with organized government or Christianity. Some thinkers even went farther, arguing that these native peoples were uncorrupted by civilization, that perhaps their civilizations were superior to our own. These ideas were published in a series of popular pamphlets and books known as travel literature. What these books taught Europeans was that certain ideas, such as religion and government and society, were relative. In other words, customs and traditions varied from one place to another. No one culture, including European culture, was superior to any other. Thus, what have we learned? The online lecture is all about those who challenged the status quo. That status quo was one built upon ancient teachings, feudal traditions, and rigid Christianity. But beginning in the 16th century, the status quo faced a number of challenges. Science was one of those sparks behind these challenges. Men like Copernicus, Galileo, Newton challenged ancient teachings and church beliefs through their scientific research. Meanwhile, John Locke challenged the concepts of feudalism and absolutism. The Tabula Rasa challenged the notion that people of different social classes are different from one another. Moreover, his praise for the Glorious Revolution in Britain challenged absolutism. Finally, as Europeans spread across the globe, their encounters with other peoples and other cultures led them to challenge the notion that European civilization was superior to others. The celebration of the noble savage led some to ask questions about freedom and inequality. Now that's it for now. As we continue our study of the Enlightenment, we will see where these challenges are going to lead us and Western civilization. Thank you for listening.